I think a lot of people look at podcasting and they're like, oh, that's my ticket to overnight success. Like, that's how I'm going to be an overnight superstar. And that's not really that, unless you are a celebrity or a comedian with some sort of built-in audience. I don't think that's really going to happen for you in most cases. When a person has a defined purpose around what their podcast is looking to do and who it is looking to speak to specifically, like your audience, perfect audience avatar member, until you have those things figured out, I don't think it's a good idea to hit record at all.
Welcome to the Advisors Fuel podcast, where high-performing financial planners and wealth advisors discover proven processes and actionable strategies to elevate their client experience, grow their businesses faster, and achieve unprecedented success. Here's your host, Adam Koch, founder at Adrenaline Advisor Consulting at adrenalineadvisor.com.
All right, everybody. I am joined today by Kyle Andrew, somebody not only who's, I guess, been a consultant of mine for years, but somebody I consider a true friend. He's also a podcast strategist, producer. He's been helping business owners, financial advisors around the country launch and grow high-quality podcasts since 2018. Through his company, In-House Podcasts, Kyle works with entrepreneurs, financial advisors, professional service firms to create podcasts that build authority, strengthen client relationships, and support long-term business growth. He brings a strategy-first approach to podcasting, which is my favorite part about it. He's not just producing for you and trying to just figure out how to do the tech stuff. He's actually helping you strategize and build just with technical production expertise, platform decisions, hardware decisions, like the stuff that makes this stuff difficult, not only on the front end, but ongoing. Basically create polished, purposeful content without letting the podcast be an actual burden on your practice, because this stuff's not easy, but you got to make it as easy as possible, and that's what he does. He focuses on helping businesses launch shows the right way, improving consistency if you already have a show, refining your message, and turning podcasting into a long-term marketing asset that doesn't stop giving. So, Kyle, we've done this before in a webinar. Thanks for hanging out. We're going to do a podcast today.
Absolutely, Adam. Thank you so much for having me. It's good to see you.
Yeah, you too, man. I want to know, because I've never asked you this before, but what originally pulled you into podcast strategy and production to begin with? And I guess what made you want to work with business owners and specifically financial advisors?
So I think I found podcasting accidentally. I'd always been a terrestrial radio fan. I listened to a lot of sports talk radio, driving around in the car growing up. I remember really early memories of hearing the Howard Stern show even. So talk radio has always been a little bit in my blood and just something I've consumed. I am a musician by trade. That's kind of how I made that transition into podcasting and audio production, was because I'd spent so much time around microphones, but I sometimes can't listen to music and I just need to listen to talking. Flash forward, I think it's around 2016, I really started to check out, I think WTF with Mark Maron was probably one of my first gateway podcasts. I also listened to another really good podcast called Finding Richard Simmons, a weird mystery about how he just disappeared from public life all at once. And I really enjoyed the format. I really enjoyed, the ability to tell stories and that sort of a format, but also I feel like I'm an auditory learner. So I do pick up on conversations. That's how I learn, is by listening to other people. So the formats themselves are interesting to me. By about 2018, I had some extra income where I bought some microphones and some equipment and just started the process of teaching myself how to do this. And then flash forward another 18 months or so, and I find myself on freelancer websites like Upwork or Fiverr, trying to find some clients and see if I can get some editing work for real. And it's developed into what we're going to talk about more in depth today.
I think being that you're a musician, being that you do live gigs, that comes with kind of some required knowledge at the end of the day, where you have to know a lot about the equipment, how it flows through, things that might be secondhand to you wouldn't be so obvious to others, things like cloud lifters and external audio cards and Shure SM7Bs, depending on how much money you want to spend, right?
Yeah, it can be a little bit of a headache when you're starting to look at, especially somebody who's on the fence on if they even want to do podcasting. They think they want to do it, but they don't want to invest the money for an SM7B. A lot of the times when I'm making podcast equipment recommendations for people, it's what's going to work for you, that's within your budget, that's going to be easy for you to be able to reuse on a regular basis. So much of podcasting is just setting yourself up for success in the future to be able to continue to make your content on a regular basis. And, sometimes the simpler the equipment, so long as it sounds good, sometimes simple equipment can, help somebody get to the finish line in that respect.
I always like to frame it as a good, better, best. And I don't think there even needs to be three. It can just be good and best or better and best. But let's just say a financial advisor says, I'm thinking about starting a podcast. What are the first things that they need to think about before they even remotely hit record? Start from the very beginning.
I would say why.
Okay.
Why do you want to start a podcast? If you can't tell me a why, I would ask you to go back and think about that why. I actually was talking with another one of my podcast producer friends in the industry earlier this week, and we had this conversation. And we both have a very similar screening question for this part of the conversation with a potential client. What is it that you're looking to do with your show? Now, I have naturally gravitated to working more with business owners like yourself and other financial planners throughout the industry, just because I find it a lot easier to form the purpose of your show or the message or the call to action for your show if there is a business on the other end of it. But sometimes, more times than I care to admit, I'll be talking with somebody who says, oh, me and my friends, we have the funniest conversations. We think everybody should hear them. Or I want to be like a Joe Rogan, for lack of a better example. That's just a catch-all. That's when I know, okay, this probably isn't a person that's going to work out for me personally as a long-term client, just because the goal isn't very refined. And I think a lot of people think of podcasts as a way, maybe not so much now, but especially earlier in my career when I'm starting, I think a lot of people look at podcasting and they're like, oh, that's my ticket to overnight success. Like, that's how I'm going to be an overnight superstar. And that's not really that, unless you are a celebrity or a comedian with some sort of built-in audience. I don't think that's really going to happen for you in most cases. When a person has a defined purpose around what their podcast is looking to do and who it is looking to speak to specifically, like your audience, perfect audience avatar member, until you have those things figured out, I don't think it's a good idea to hit record at all. So really just ask yourself, what's the purpose of me making it? What sort of content am I going to be able to share that's going to be beneficial to my listener? And then kind of work it from there.
I want to ask you about purpose, and I want to tie in, I guess, two examples as you do that. But I echo your thoughts. Marketing is one of those funny things. And I think some of the best financial advisors in the country, let alone the world, are some of the worst marketers. And I'm not picking on them. It's just they're so good at what they do. But it's almost like they're a car dealership selling cars in the middle of a cornfield surrounded by corn with no sign and no lights on. It's like nobody knows you're there. So it's like you have to get good at marketing, in my opinion, so that you can go out and save people from bad advice and bad advisors and do the good job that you do. And I think the problem with our industry is that there's so many people out there who maybe aren't the best advisors in the world, who are doing such great marketing, unfortunately, for the client, unfortunately for the rest of us. And so I think that the good advisors don't want to be like the bad advisors, so they kind of shun some of that great marketing. So podcasting, in my opinion, is one of the many marketing tools you can use to build familiarity and basically solidify yourself as a thought leader. And
Absolutely.
You said you have to have a why. And I remember when you and I had this conversation years ago at this point. But give me one example. Don't use mine, use others that you've talked about, but give me one, or just a hypothetical example of a good why, and hesitate to say a bad why.
Yeah. So I think it would probably be easier to start with the bad why. The bad why would be anything that's first and foremost self-serving for somebody who's trying to just become, I say celebrity, a kind of tongue-in-cheek style, but somebody who's just looking to elevate their overall status and just have that be that. They want to be an influencer, probably not in a very specific space. People who are just seeking some sort of fame like that, probably a bad why. I think a good why is to share your expertise. So I know that we're in the financial planning space here and what we're talking about and with your shows. I do work with another show who is also in the financial planner space. Specifically, though, they just do advice for optometrists. When I tell people that is my most successful show, financial advice for optometrists, they all laugh at me and think I'm telling them a joke. But I'm very serious in that it's a value-packed show. The idea for that show started off as like general white coat sort of professions. So dentists, optometrists, veterinarians. While we were developing the content over maybe like the first 30 episodes, we'd realized that the majority of the clients that were calling, or majority people who were interested in working with that advisor, tended to work in optometry, and this person's wife is a former optometrist too. So it just fit from that regard. With the value that show brings, it's practical advice that people within that trade often have questions about, and the way that it's delivered, usually through conversation. Sometimes there are some short solo episodes, but it's meant to unpack, the certain parts of whatever topic that is for the day, and then give some actionable next steps as to how you can start to implement this into your business. Or if you have more questions on it, pick up the phone, we can schedule a call, things like that. The difference between good podcasts and bad podcasts, it sounds so stupid and so simple. The good podcasts look to deliver their listener some value, practical value within their business, not just like the value of, oh, that was a funny podcast for an hour. You know what I mean?
What about an advisor says, because I hear this sometimes, when I tell people they ought to consider a podcast. I don't like telling people what they should do. I like telling people what we do and why it worked, and suggesting that they should do the same, even if it is strongly suggesting. But a lot of advisors, they already write a newsletter, or they host events. Let's just say they post on social media here and there. Maybe they're sending market updates. What does a podcast do differently than those other channels?
I think the ability for a listener or a consumer of the content, so in this case, podcasting, I think it's the best opportunity to develop, or for them to develop with you, sort of a parasocial relationship. Parasocial relationship, usually used in a derogatory sense. Somebody's sitting online a little too much, following their favorite Instagram accounts a little too closely, things like that. In this instance, because you're giving good, valuable advice to somebody who, in this instance, you're probably going to hope is going to give you a call and become a potential client of yours. I think the important part about it is they're going to develop a closeness with you that you aren't going to really be aware of. I mean, you see the download numbers, but you don't know who exactly that person is.
Right.
They're consuming your content. They're getting more comfortable with you. They're getting to know you in a more conversational tone and manner. And that all by itself is going to make it much more likely, especially if you're given good advice. Again, it's going to make it much more likely that they're going to feel comfortable to give you a call, pick up the phone and give you a call, because they already have so much time invested in, quote unquote, talking with you, even though it's a one-sided conversation. So while everything else, like a newsletter or a blog or social media accounts, while all of those things are helpful and they're all part of it, and you can even use a podcast recording to be repurposed in those other formats, I think the authenticity that you get while you're having a 30, 60-minute podcast discussion or listening to one from a person goes a lot further than that super curated, refined, edited, Instagram picture or well-written newsletter or whatever it is. The authenticity, I think, connects a heck of a lot closer with a person who could be a potential client.
I totally agree with that. And then what you mentioned a second ago about building familiarity. You're saying it's a one-sided conversation. They feel like it's a conversation because they're listening and they hear you and they get to know you. And especially if you just be yourself, that authenticity is huge. I know years and years ago, in the 2000s, a lot of the articles I'd read about how many touches it takes to build that trust is right. I know in the 20 teens, it was like 12 to 14. These days, I'm hearing 20 something.
I've heard 27 fairly recently. Yeah.
I thought it was 24. So 27. So, I mean, if you're doing these podcasts and, we won't talk about this today, but you take those podcasts, you use the right software, you're able to slice and dice those up into repurposed shorts that can be posted anywhere and everywhere. That's more touches at the end of the day. That's more familiarity. What would you say are the biggest mistakes you see business owners making when they launch a podcast?
I think a lot of business owners, and I'm kind of going through this right now with a client who I think we've made the equipment decisions for them and they're in a good spot now. But a lot of times people will, especially people who haven't done it in the past, they may over invest in top of the line equipment. And, it's good to have quality equipment, obviously. But if you aren't sure if you're going to stick to a podcast long term, and by long term, I would say at least for 30 episodes. That's typically like the number for what they call pod burn or pod fade. If people don't make it for 30 episodes, that's usually, but on the opposite side of that, if you do make it at least 30 episodes, your likelihood of continuing to produce podcasts for a long time goes up dramatically. I think people overinvest in equipment up front before they're even really sold or like fully invested in making the content. And then, a few months down the road, they realize, oh, I don't like to be on camera all that much, or I'm not as well spoken as I thought I was, or man, editing's a real pain in the butt. I'm having a tough time finding an editor. There are a lot of different things after the fact. A lot of people, I think, hurt themselves when they buy that type of equipment. In their mind, they're like elevating what they think they're going to do with it. The best advice in terms of equipment that I can give, and I kind of said it earlier, was sometimes, keep it simple, stupid is best. And you want to be able to set yourself up to be able to make your podcast every week as effortlessly as it can be in terms of recording. I mean, you're still going to have to do your content planning and, figure out when an episode's going to be and figure out what your talking points are going to be, or if you're going to have a guest or interview somebody. But I think a lot of people overinvest in the front before they're even completely dedicated or committed to the idea of carrying on a podcast long term. Because unfortunately, it's not like you just release one episode and everybody finds you.
I wish.
It's a long-term commitment. Just be sure that you want to continue with it before you go and invest a few $1,000s into stuff that's going to sit at the corner of your desk for the next couple of years.
The podcast burn. Did you say podcast? Is it podcast burn? Is that what you said?
Yeah, pod fade or just burned out, pod burn. Yeah.
It reminds me, I'm not a runner. I hate running, but it reminds me of back when I tried to train for a marathon back in 2006. It reminds me of that. I'm not sure what mile is you're supposed to get the cramp. It's probably at like 14. For me, it was like 7. but it reminds me if you can get past that cramp. So let's just say you get past the pod fade, the pod burn, and you're gone past that. You're on to episode 50, 60, 70 and beyond. For the financial advisor who's already got a podcast, but they feel like it's not growing or it's not producing the results that they want, what are the first things you're looking at? What are you evaluating?
From an analytical perspective, I would probably go and look at their catalog of past episodes first and just see how it is presented. So, like, how are you titling things? What's the searchability of this title? What's the searchability of your podcast name? What does your podcast description have in it that is going to help a potential listener who is, actively looking for your content? What are the keywords in there that are going to be able to help them find your podcast? I think a lot of people, and I was certainly guilty of this earlier, when I just started making my own podcast before I started working with other clients, a lot of times it would be like, all right, it's recorded, it's edited, it's uploaded to my distribution service, it's out the door, it's out of my hands now. Mm-hmm. Never really considering all of the things from like a text perspective that makes a podcast episode discoverable. So overall title of the show is something that you need to be cognizant of, how you're titling episodes, and then the overall presentation of your show notes. Sometimes people do really detailed show notes. Some people will even have like transcriptions of show notes up on their websites. All of those things are good, but do want to make sure that you have keyword rich terms that are related to your, podcast, related to your topic. You want to make sure all that stuff is interwoven into your show notes and your titles very naturally. I'd say that's where I would start. There could be a million other things that could be going on. You could be a bad host. Maybe you're a bad editor or you have a bad editor. Those things can contribute to people not basically committing to listening to the podcast. Like they'll get in, listen to 5 minutes and be like, oh, this sounds like crap. I'm all set. Or, oh, this guy says a lot. This is a waste of my time. So it could be something like that from a production perspective where you're just not editing well on the back end or you're not preparing yourself to record enough. I would say those are probably the two places that I would look at. But then also the third prong here that I'd probably look at as well, probably all at the same time, taking a look at what your existing tool set looks like in terms of promotion. So do you have an email list? Do you have strong social followings like on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, things like that? If you do, how can we better utilize those to make sure that your show is being, shared in the appropriate circles? I think a lot of times people, I don't know this for a fact, but I know I certainly felt this way at certain points, and I know that I have friends who have, but in terms of clients who are doing it for marketing for their business, I think sometimes people get a little embarrassed to share their podcast on socials, especially if they have a lot of friends and family on there and it's not just business connections. People feel a little vulnerable hopefully, we can help you overcome that as well to be able to fully utilize everything that you have at your disposal in terms of your network. But a lot of times it's just people not making good use of the other parts of podcasting, like the recording and editing is the huge part of it, distribution, but like also the planning up front and then the distribution and marketing and promotion on the back end as well. Sometimes people don't always have all three steps in them. They just kind of record and distribute and post and pray that somebody finds it,
Yeah. I really struggled initially. Back in 2015, I kind of started doing this, and I really struggled initially with even remotely considering posting anything that I had recorded anywhere where friends and family would see it, because I'm not the person that goes out and talks about work with friends. Even if somebody asks me a question about work, first of all, I recognize that if you really pay attention, I think a lot of times when people ask us about our work, they're almost embarrassed to. They feel like they're wasting your time, or they should be paying you for whatever advice you're giving them, when really, they're just looking for some help from somebody they trust, right? And they trust you. And then we don't want to look like the people who are just talking about work all the time, right? So I really struggled with that initially. But what I found was by posting these things online, you can post the recordings and the snippets, and people find out, people who are close to you that didn't really know what you did, they learn what you do, and they maybe they ask more questions. Maybe there's somebody out there who is an acquaintance that normally wouldn't have asked you for an intro call, let's just say, or asked you some more digging questions about what you do for a living and how you might be able to help them, because they just didn't know what you did. It's kind of like back during COVID when they had those tiles that would come out, all those memes that would be like, here's what my boss thinks I do, here's what my mom thinks I do, here's what my coworkers think I do, here's what I actually do. It's like that. But to change gears just quickly for a second here, how should an advisor think about choosing the right format? So this is something that you and I spent a lot of time talking about a while back, and that is, whether to do solo work. So I call them solo casts. So whether we're doing a solo cast where you've got like a PowerPoint up and you're talking, or maybe there's no PowerPoint, you've just got notes and you're just going to sit there and monologue, versus guest interviews, versus co-hosted conversations, client education, and then some of these maybe you're shorter than others. How would you talk to an advisor about choosing the right format and how to do what they're going to do?
Yeah, formats can be tricky. It does play into what I said a couple of times now at this point, is making sure that you have something that's easily repeatable. So if you're going to commit to a 60-minute episode each week or whatever, once every other week, I do advise if you're doing podcasting, weekly is probably the best cadence to release episodes. But when it comes to format, I think the first question is, what am I going to be able to do consistently? The second question is, what value does this bring, and can I do it in a shorter amount of time, or do I need a full hour? Some people, especially if it's a conversationally driven podcast with two people or a host and a guest, 60 minutes might be appropriate, because there's going to be follow-up questions. There's going to be additional information that you're outlined, the questions that you send to your guest. There's going to be natural follow-up questions. From the perspective of like time, it's tough. A lot of people say you should try to keep a podcast under 30 minutes. Average commute to work in the US is about 25 minutes right now. And the reason I bring that up is the thought process is most people are thinking people are consuming podcasts on the way to or from work. 25 minutes, I think personally, is a little short for a podcast. But, on the opposite side of that, I did just launch a show earlier this year where the host was working in a 60-minute format on their other show. And now they're doing a show that they aim very intentionally to have it be a 20-minute podcast. And they're very transparent about that when they're recording and talking to their audience, because that's the agreement. Like, we're trying to give you simple, actionable steps, and we don't want to take up all your time and do it. We want you to, get this bite-sized information, learn a little bit more about how you can start to implement that into your business, and then we'll see you next week. So the repeatability of it, the ease of it, and then just determining who your ideal listener avatar is, it's not easy to predict. I mean, unless you're, like that optometry example I brought up earlier, we know specifically optometrists are going to be listening to that one. Just make sure that it's a way that is easily repeatable for you, the host, the producer, whatever it is, and that there is still value. Now, can you get value out of a 2.5 hour, 3 hour conversational podcast?
Wow.
Sure, you could. It's just going to take you a lot of time to get that. And I don't think it's very nice of you to waste your listeners' time like that. I do think you need to be respectful of the fact that people are dedicating time to you and your show, and you don't want to waste time. You want to acknowledge the fact that they're investing your time and that you're thankful for it. I probably wouldn't advise anything over an hour in most cases, but again, what's going to be easiest for you, the host, to be able to show up and be able to repeat those steps week to week?
I know you and I have gone through all this stuff, obviously, so I'm kind of cheating here, but I've done 12-minute episodes. I've done 20-minute episodes. I've done 30-minute episodes. I've done 45 minutes. I've done one with Meb Faber that ended up being so much fun, and we went on so many tangents upon tangents that we had to stop and do a part 2, and I think in total ended up being somewhere in the ballpark of like an hour and 45 minutes in total. But I remember you telling me, and you already stole the answer to my question I was going to ask you next, which is about consistency. So you've already answered it. But I remember you telling me the best podcast frequency is the one you're going to use and the one you're going to stick to. I think that everybody's different. Everybody, you know your client base, you know your audience. Well, you should anyway. And if your audience is the type that's retired and wants to listen to an hour and a half long podcast, then maybe that's what you should do, and just do it consistently. But
yeah. And I think one of the things people don't always consider, and this is like less about who your ideal listener avatar is and just more generally about who consumes podcasts. Podcast listeners, and I am very much this person, podcast listeners are creatures of habit. When you launch a show, you are making an agreement with that audience to show up. Let's just say, for sake of ease, it's every Monday. You're releasing a new episode at 6 a.m. every Monday. The listeners come to expect that, and you try your best to adhere to it. These people, once you drop off with that cadence, especially if there's no explanation, sometimes things happen in the podcasting world where you don't have an episode, or like you lose something in an edit and you're like, crap, I can't redo this before 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. Let me put out a quick message. Hey, I'm sorry, everybody. The episode this week, blah, 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 happened. Just wanted to let you know we'll be back next week. That would go over a hell of a lot better than just, for whatever reason, randomly not posting your episode on a Monday morning out of the true blue after you've been doing it for the last 6 months.
that's interesting.
So just, be cognizant of the fact that you're making an agreement with the listener, and that listener is somebody who, creature habit, has those expectations, and hopefully you're able to meet those.
Yeah. So if an advisor listening, watching to this episode, ironically enough, we're doing a podcast episode, right? And they want to explore podcasting. What are the best first steps that they should take, and what kind of things should they be thinking about? Because I just want to disclose, free plug here for you. You and I have been working together for a long time, whether it's the planning up front, getting it started, the right equipment, pre-production, post-production, editing, show notes, keyword search terms, good titles, getting to good titles. These are all things that you've done for me. So all I had to do was just put together the content, hit record, and send it all to you, and you do the rest. So tell me more about that.
I think the question is, if somebody is considering a podcast, what should they do in order to make sure it's the right decision for them?
More so, if somebody's considering to do this, understanding how it sounds so complicated, how can they use someone like you for help? What things should they be thinking about in terms of before they even talk to you? And then how does that relationship look?
So before they even talk to me, this is with the assumption that they're a podcast enjoyer. I have had people approach me and being like, I've never listened to a podcast, but I think it might be good for my business. To which I would say, all right, go listen to podcasts in your space then, and get familiar with what that might look like, and try to envision yourself in that role. And then, they obviously start to develop some content ideas just naturally off of that. And then they'll come back and talk to me a little bit later and determine if it's going to be a good fit at all. Assuming that you're somebody who is already familiar with podcasts, has an idea for what you'd like to do in terms of a format or a show idea or whatever, the way that I work with businesses, like we mentioned before, I've helped businesses launch shows from square one. And then I've also come in and worked with shows that were pre-existing, who were kind of looking, for lack of a better term, a little bit of a facelift, and, try to get things going in the right direction.
That was me. Yeah. I needed a bunch of help. Yeah.
And that's what I'm here to do. What I want people to be able to do is, and this is going to sound kind of stupid, I think, but I want people to feel confident in what they're doing in terms of their content production. So I don't know anything about financial planning. I'm just some guy, but I know that you know about financial planning. How can we get the most mileage out of your knowledge, basically, to be able to put this into a podcast format and then have the people who need to hear it and hopefully give you a call at the end of the funnel. It sounds dumb, but I just want to make sure that I'm able to help people be the best version of themselves in terms of content production. So like you said, you would come up with your idea, you'd hit record, you would send me an email, hey, this one's all set in this folder, and I would edit it and distribute it for you guys, without an issue. Basically, once you hit stop on the recording, I take over the rest. I want people to be able to not have the technical back end stuff basically impede their ability to get their voice out to the world. So typically I will take the recording and pick it up and run from there after the initial setup stuff that we have to do for new podcasts, in terms of equipment purchasing and distribution and setting it to all the places that needs to be sent to, like Spotify and Apple Podcasts and YouTube and things like that. I think I answered your question, but I think maybe I danced around it a little bit.
No, that's perfect. I think bottom line is I jumped in and said that, that's where I was. I was already doing a podcast, but I found that I needed the help. Full disclosure, I have a music studio in my basement. I thought I, knew what I was doing, and I did to a certain extent in terms of equipment, but where I was missing was I didn't know how to put together keywords. I didn't know how to do the show notes properly. We figured out how to get it onto Apple Podcasts and Spotify and these places, but we had no clue how to do good post-production. It was taking a lot of time. So all the, barriers to entry for people who have good knowledge that needs to get out there into the public to educate the public, it's that all these barriers to entry that say, I can't do this because it's too much work and it's too hard. All I can say is, Kyle, I don't mean to plug you here again, but if anybody listening or watching has knowledge, they want to get out into the public and wants to create another, call it a marketing arm or a medium of marketing that you can take and educate the public in your community or nationwide for that matter, because obviously it's everywhere, right? All you need to do is talk to him, get the right equipment purchased. If you have writer's block and you can't come up with ideas, the beauty of the world we live in today is there's this little thing called AI that you could just take a bunch of your past articles you've written in the past, a bunch of maybe ideas you might have written down over the years, whether it be on your Apple Notes or in a Word document, throw it into AI and say, give me a program for this quarter of content that I could write or that I could record, and there's your content. And all you have to do is, once the equipment's set up, is hit record it, end the recording, and send it off to Kyle. And he's just going to do the rest. It's kind of cool. So thanks so much for joining me today, man. This was a great conversation. Obviously, I loved the webinar we did as well, but I think it gets us all thinking about how much we can, think more strategically about podcasting, not just another content task that we have to do, but, as a way to build true authority. It's thought leadership, create stronger relationships with our clients and prospective clients, and really how to develop long-term marketing assets that live out there forever. And that's one of the beauties of podcasting and everything that comes from it. So for anybody who's listening, who wants to learn more about Kyle or explore whether a podcast could make sense for their business, we'll include links to in-house podcasts and Kyle's podcast strategy call page in the show notes. Just click that, head over there, do an intro call with him. Worst case scenario, you're going to learn something, worst case. And as I always say, there's thousands and thousands of podcasts out there, and you chose to give ours a listen today. So thank you so much for spending some time with us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for tuning in to the Advisors Fuel podcast. For more articles, videos, and resources, or to schedule an intro call, visit adrenalineadvisor.com. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for financial or legal advice. Always talk to your compliance department before implementing any of the ideas shared in this episode.